It was a still, warm afternoon in the quiet, sleepy suburb of McLean, Virginia, a town where the lawns were trimmed to perfection, where mailbox flags rarely stayed raised longer than an hour, and where folks still waved politely to one another, whether they meant it or not. And on this particular Tuesday, not a soul in the neighborhood could have imagined that their day would end with police sirens, guns drawn, and a retired Navy sniper sprawled face down on the grass he had just been meticulously watering. But for Chief Petty Officer Jack Ramsey, whose 20-year military career had seen him endure desert heat, freezing nights on the decks of aircraft carriers, covert operations under the veil of plausible deniability, and more enemies sighted through a high-powered scope than he cared to count, it was just another unexpected chapter in a life that never quite let him rest, never let him fully exhale, even when the uniform was folded and stored away in a cedar chest at the back of the closet, in his modest two-story colonial home. And that day Jack, dressed in simple jeans and a faded navy t-shirt, with a black ball cap shading his eyes from the hazy sun, had his mind far from war zones and secrets. He was thinking about whether to mow the back lawn after dinner or wait until morning, whether the rust spot on his old Chevy truck needed attention before inspection, and whether the new neighbors across the street, the couple with the toddler and the golden retriever, would come over for barbecue next weekend, not knowing that within moments, the quiet he had slowly taught himself to embrace would be shattered by the shriek of tires and the sudden jarring blare of authoritative voices commanding obedience, ripping him out of civilian peace and dropping him back into a world of adrenaline and protocol, though this time it was from the other side of the rifle. As the two police cruisers slammed to a halt, gravel kicking up against the curb, doors burst open and officers emerged in synchronized, trained movement, hands on weapons, eyes locked in, shouting, "Hands where we can see them!" in voices thick with urgency, nerves and perhaps just a tinge of uncertainty, for they had not expected their target to be calmly watering his hydrangeas with a green garden hose. Jack's instincts, refined over 2 decades of split-second decisions, kicked in before his thoughts could, and he let the hose drop from his hand with a small splash onto the grass, slowly raising his arms with a calmness that belied the whirlwind of questions forming in his head. Who were they? What did they think he had done? Was this a case of mistaken identity or something far deeper and darker? He turned slowly, deliberately, every movement calculated to convey non-aggression, his eyes locking with the nearest officers, young, maybe 30, maybe new to the force, sweat forming on his brow beneath the brim of his cap. And then, with no resistance, Jack allowed himself to be approached, ordered to the ground and cuffed, his cheek pressed against the soft dirt of his own front lawn, the smell of earth and grass suddenly so sharp in his nostrils that it transported him, absurdly, back to his survival training days in Quantico, when he first learned how to disappear in foliage. The neighborhood, still sleepy seconds before, had begun to stir. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open, a dog barked wildly at the sudden invasion of chaos, and across the street, Mrs. Langley dropped her lemonade glass on the porch, the ice scattering like marbles as she stared, mouth agape at the man she had once seen help an elderly neighbor, shovel snow now being frisked for weapons. Jack said nothing, offered no protest, only narrowed his eyes against the sun, and waited as they read him his Miranda rights, his thoughts already scanning for variables, connections, implications. He had no warrants, no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket in the last 6 years, and he hadn't spoken to anyone in his old unit since Christmas. So what the hell was this? The officers didn't elaborate as they tightened the cuffs, too tight, perhaps on purpose, perhaps out of fear, and lifted him roughly to his feet, guiding him toward the cruiser as the neighborhood watched, recording on phones, whispering, speculating. Someone shouted, "What did he do?" And someone else answered, "Weapons smuggling, I heard." Words Jack caught like a slap, jolting him with realization, because weapons smuggling wasn't just a random crime, it was specific, it was personal, and it hinted at something he thought had been buried under layers of classified briefings and buried reports years ago, during a deployment where things went sideways and not every crate was logged, not every manifest accounted for. Was it coming back to haunt him now? Was this tied to the operations in Ukraine, the ghost shipments, the encrypted phone calls with unnamed contacts that weren't always logged through official channels? And then it hit him. Someone must have tipped them off, someone with enough knowledge to make it sound convincing, but not enough context to know what really happened. Or worse, someone who knew exactly what happened and wanted to use that knowledge to destroy him. As he was pushed into the back seat of the cruiser, the hot leather sticking to his arms, Jack stared out the window, not at the crowd gathering around his yard, but at the skyline just beyond the trees, where he could almost make out the distant rooftops of the Pentagon, the institution that had once trusted him with a rifle and a country's secrets, and now, perhaps, had let him fall into the hands of those unaware of what he had done, what he had sacrificed. The ride to the station was silent except for the crackle of police radio and the occasional squawk of a dispatcher relaying code numbers, and all the while Jack's mind was racing, not with panic, but with cold, structured calculation, dissecting. Possibilities like blueprints, someone set this up, but who? And why now? Why here, in his retirement? What were they hoping to find? When they pulled up to the precinct, the officers opened the door and guided him out. And as the heavy metal door to the building closed behind him with a thud, Jack Ramsey, Navy sniper, war veteran, unintentional suspect, knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone had opened a door they shouldn't have, and soon someone high up, maybe very high up, was going to have to answer for it. It had been less than 45 minutes since Chief Petty Officer Jack Ramsey had been booked, cuffed, and locked behind the cool, scuffed steel door of Interrogation Room B, and already Detective Aileen Mallory, an 8-year veteran of the force with a reputation for methodical precision and instincts honed sharp by watching hundreds of suspects crack like porcelain, was feeling the kind of itch she didn't like, the kind that started between the shoulder blades and crept into her jaw when something felt off. And as she sat in her cluttered office surrounded by whiteboards, overflowing case files, and the soft hum of the precinct's ancient ventilation system, her eyes flicked over Jack's file again and again, each pass revealing nothing incriminating. No cracks, no convenient shadows to shine a light into, just page after page of glowing military service, letters of commendation, operations listed only by numbers and vague locations, and a discharge report that described him as exemplary under duress and capable of operating in hostile, independent conditions with minimal oversight, all of which only made her feel worse, not better, because this was not the kind of man you typically dragged in on felony suspicion, and certainly not for something as serious as international weapons trafficking, which, according to the thin evidence pile on her desk, he was now tentatively suspected of facilitating through a series of encrypted communications and a customs package flagged by Homeland Security for containing what appeared to be restricted high-tech targeting optics with his name and address on the shipping manifest, but even that felt brittle, too convenient, and possibly planted, though she wasn't ready to go down that rabbit hole just yet. Across the hall, through the one-way glass, Jack sat with his arms folded in the center of a grey metal table, his expression unreadable, not smug, not worried but focused, calm in a way that was not passive but observant, as if he were still on assignment and merely waiting for the next mission cue to arrive. And that bothered Mallory more than she wanted to admit, because she had interrogated enough suspects to know the difference between defiance and discipline. And Jack Ramsey did not flinch, did not shuffle in his seat, did not ask for water or attempt conversation, merely stared straight ahead, or occasionally into the camera in the top corner of the room. And when she had entered earlier to read the standard rights and begin the usual small-talk preamble, he had cut her off politely but firmly, asking for legal counsel and saying nothing else, leaving her with a growing pile of questions and no leverage with which to extract answers. Outside her office, a young officer, Reed, fresh from patrol, leaned against the wall nursing a half-empty coffee cup and peered into the observation window with a confused frown, muttering, "That guy's military?" To which Mallory, half expecting the remark, answered sharply, "Retired sniper, SEAL qualified. You want to be the one to raise your voice in there." And Reed blushed, mumbling something about surveillance footage before walking away. Back at her desk, Mallory clicked through the digital file again, focusing now on the intel report that had triggered the arrest. anonymous source, flagged through an interagency data sharing program, and she noted the reference code was from the Joint Threat Intelligence Group, which was odd in itself because they didn't usually share preliminary tips with local precincts unless someone from upstairs had pushed it through channels. And there was the itch again, worse now, crawling around her ribs, whispering that she might have just stepped on a landmine labeled national security without being briefed. Still, she had a job to do. And the captain, Stevens, a career cop with a temper and a dislike for the military's closed-door culture, had made it clear this was a book-and-build situation. Arrest first, build a case later, especially if there was a potential headline in it. And Stevens, who had walked into the interrogation room earlier with a swagger and a folder full of photos showing crates of gear seized in Croatia with serial numbers loosely connected to a past SEAL, unit Jack had served in, had been visibly frustrated when Jack remained silent, uncowed and unbothered by threats of federal charges. "Guy thinks he's untouchable," Stevens had said, slamming the door behind him. But Mallory wasn't so sure. This didn't feel like arrogance. It felt like certainty, like Jack knew something they didn't, something bigger than any of them were prepared to see. And the more she thought about it, the more that certainty scared her. She rose from her desk and walked slowly to the observation window again, crossing her arms as she stared at Jack's profile. He was motionless except for the occasional blink, but his eyes were always moving, studying corners, measuring distance, calculating angles, and it dawned on her then that this wasn't just a retired soldier. This was someone trained to anticipate hostile movement, to respond to danger with action measured in milliseconds, and the sheer discipline he radiated was beginning to ripple through the precinct like heat off a blacktop. A few desks down, Officer Jaime Patel, who'd served a tour in Afghanistan before joining the force, muttered to another officer, "You see the way he sat down? That guy could clear this whole floor before backup arrived." And while it was said half in jest, Mallory noted how no one laughed. The psychological effect was real, and Jack, whether he intended to or not, had flipped the room into a state of contained alert, like a lion caged but not sleeping. And now, as she flipped open the printed transcript of the intercepted phone logs, Mallory's frown deepened. The calls were there, yes. Encrypted traffic routed through layered VPNs with timestamps consistent with European arms markets, but the voice authentication was redacted, flagged as non-verifiable, which meant no voice match, which meant no proof, which meant the entire arrest was hanging on circumstantial garbage and a customs slip from a suspiciously clean package. And that's when she finally said it out loud, softly at first, then again with more force. "This doesn't make sense." And Patel looked up from his paperwork, raising an eyebrow. "You said something." And she shook her head, murmuring, "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing, it was everything, because this kind of setup, this kind of elegant misdirection and false breadcrumb trail reeked of something she'd only read about in training. Manuals? Controlled misidentification? A tactic used in counterintelligence to draw fire onto the wrong target while protecting the real asset. And if Jack Ramsey was the decoy, or worse, the pawn, then someone out there was playing a game far above their pay grade, and they were all dancing in the middle of it without knowing the rules. She stood up, heart racing now with the thrill of a theory forming, the kind that could either solve the puzzle or blow it all to hell, and she strode down the hallway toward the evidence room, flashing her badge and asking for the chain of custody. Documents on the package that started it all, and when the clerk, a bored sergeant halfway through a sandwich, handed her the form, she scanned it quickly and froze. The initials listed under the original receipt of the seized item weren't local, they were military, and not just any branch, but a unit code flagged Sync SOCOM in small print at the bottom corner, the U, kind of designation that was never supposed to show up in civilian reports. And in that instant, everything changed because now she knew. The precinct had never known silence like this, not even during the power outage 2 winters ago, not even when an officer's funeral procession passed down the front steps with flags lowered and heads bowed. But now, on this strange, static Thursday morning, with fluorescent lights buzzing slightly and radios turned down to near mute, everyone from desk clerks to detectives stood in half-frozen states of disbelief as the air grew heavy with a pressure none could explain and none dared ignore. Because just moments earlier, the normal hum of duty had been shattered by the arrival of 3 matte black Suburbans, their windows tinted so dark they swallowed the sun, pulling up to the front of the building in such synchronized precision. It was as if they had rehearsed the moment dozens of times, and when the doors opened, the boots that hit the ground didn't belong to regular military. They belonged to something far more elite, far more unsettling. 4 military police, uniformed, hard-jawed and moving with quiet authority, surrounded a single man in the center, whose presence made Captain Stevens' cigarette fall from his fingers before he could even get the lighter out. And that man, tall, grey-haired, with medals peeking from beneath his dark army trench coat, and eyes that had seen presidents rise and fall, was none other than General Marcus Halstead, a name that meant little to the average civilian, but which sent immediate ripples through the precinct's ranks, like a stone dropped into still water, because while Halstead had not appeared on television nor made headlines, those within federal or intelligence-adjacent roles knew him as a commanding force behind numerous shadow operations, a strategic ghost behind Special Operations Command, and perhaps most importantly, a man who did not visit local police stations unless something very wrong had occurred. And now here he was, stepping inside without ceremony, his stride firm but unhurried, his expression like carved granite, flanked by officers who said nothing but radiated that particular calm born of missions where speaking could mean death. And it was then that Stevens, his voice an octave higher than usual, rushed forward to meet him, half saluting, half sputtering something about authorization and the nature of the situation, to which Halstead gave no reply, merely letting his gaze drift across the room like a satellite scanning for threats, before finally settling on Detective Aileen Mallory, who stood frozen by the interrogation window, her notes forgotten in her hand, because from the moment Halstead's boots touched the linoleum floor, she knew something tectonic had shifted. The arrest that had plagued her conscience for the past 24 hours was about to be rewritten by forces far beyond her jurisdiction. And as Halstead approached, he gave her the smallest of nods, an acknowledgement not of authority but of awareness, as if to say, "You're the one who saw the cracks, and because of that, you're going to be allowed to watch what comes next." And without another word, he turned to Stevens, looked him dead in the eye and said in a voice that could stop bullets, "Where is he?" And Stevens, swallowing hard, gestured toward holding room 3 like a student called out by a headmaster, and Halstead walked past him without waiting for further instruction. The MP detail remained outside, posted like statues, while Halstead entered the holding room and found Jack Ramsey seated calmly, cuffs still on, one wrist slightly red from the tight steel, his expression unreadable, but his posture unmistakably military, straight back, no slouch, eyes forward. And for the briefest of moments, the two men simply looked at each other. No words, no gestures, just two warriors separated by rank but bound by the same fire-forged code. And then, without raising his voice, Halstead said, "Get those off him." And a nearby officer, already trembling, fumbled with the keys until the cuffs clicked, loose, at which point Jack stood slowly, rubbed his wrist and said, "Took you long enough." A line that might have come across as sarcastic to anyone else, but between these two men, it carried the weight of shared history, of missions classified and erased. And Halstead didn't smile, didn't blink, only said, "You weren't supposed to be visible." And Jack replied, "I didn't make myself visible." And with that brief exchange, Mallory, standing just outside the door, realized with sickening clarity that Jack hadn't just been a retired sniper caught in a bureaucratic snare. He had been operational, active in something buried so deep it didn't even appear in federal logs, and someone had deliberately outed him, framed him in the shallowest way possible, perhaps to disrupt whatever mission he had been part of, perhaps to provoke a response like this, and now that response had arrived, and it wore stars on its shoulders. Halstead turned back to Stevens, who had entered tentatively, sweat forming beneath his collar, and said, "This arrest never happened. There will be no file. There will be no record. You're going to delete the warrant, seal the logs, and make sure every one of your officers understands what classified means before they ruin their careers over something they'll never understand." And Stevens, ever the bulldog behind a badge, began to sputter about chain of command, about jurisdiction, about transparency. but Halstead cut him off with a stare so cold it could freeze glass, saying simply, "Captain, if you speak again, I'll assume you're compromised," and Stevens, whose bravado was no match for battlefield authority, shut his mouth so tightly his lips turned white, and Mallory, watching it all, knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross. The moment you become aware of how much bigger the board really is, you can never go back to thinking you were a player. Halstead then motioned to Jack, who walked out of the room beside him like a man stepping back into purpose, and together they passed through the stunned precinct, leaving silence in their wake until just before reaching the door. Halstead turned back to Mallory and said, "You did your job. That's why you're still standing." And then, after a beat, added, "Be careful where your curiosity goes from here." And with that, they exited into the daylight, the Suburbans swallowing them once more before vanishing down the road like smoke. And all that remained was the echo of something unexplainable, a story that no one could tell and everyone would remember. And Mallory stood there in the hallway, clutching her forgotten notepad, heart pounding, understanding now that Jack Ramsey hadn't just been wrongly arrested. He had been protected. And if General Marcus Halstead had walked into a civilian stationed to apologize in person, then whatever Jack was part of was bigger than terrorism, bigger than war. It was the kind of truth that lived behind locked doors and redacted lines, and she had just glimpsed it through the crack of a bulletproof door. In the hours following General Halstead's departure, the precinct stood not in relief, but in a kind of suspended dread, like the world had tilted off its axis slightly, and everyone was waiting for it to correct or shatter completely. And Detective Aileen Mallory, who had witnessed the silent handover of one man from local law to something much higher, found herself moving through the station like a ghost, watched but never approached, respected but now feared in a subtle way, because everyone knew she had been the one who made contact, the one Halstead had acknowledged. And when power that absolute nods in your direction, people either draw close or disappear, and most had chosen the latter, whispering behind half-closed doors, changing topics when she entered the room, avoiding her eyes as if worried that looking too long might brand them with something permanent. And Captain Stevens, once bullish and loud, had retreated into his office and stayed there, blinds drawn, calls unanswered, his voice lowered to a hoarse whisper on every internal line. And it wasn't long before Mallory noticed the changes, not big at first, but undeniable. The arrest report for Jack Ramsey had vanished from the server, scrubbed so clean it no longer existed, even in the auto-archive backups. The evidence chain of custody log had a blank line where the item number used to be, and when she asked the clerk downstairs for the sign-in sheets from the day of the arrest, the woman looked up with a forced smile and said, "There's nothing." From that date might have been a system error, which was impossible because Mallory had seen those logs herself less than 48 hours ago, and now they were gone, and with them any official memory of what had taken place. And yet the silence screamed louder with each passing hour, and the sense of being watched, subtly, distantly, grew stronger every time she left the building, as if someone was waiting for her to make the wrong move, speak to the wrong person, open the wrong file. And by Friday morning, when two clean-cut men in pressed suits and thin smiles arrived at the precinct, identifying themselves as oversight auditors from Internal Affairs, claiming to be conducting a random inspection of police procedures, she knew without a doubt that she was now inside a pressure cooker, carefully disguised as protocol. And these weren't just IA agents, they were intelligence cutouts, brought in to keep the story buried and ensure that no one would be tempted to exhume it. But Mallory, driven now by something deeper than procedure, began digging, not recklessly, not openly, but methodically, quietly, using the skills she had spent years perfecting, searching file versions offline, printing backup metadata from shared drives before they too vanished, taking home redacted forms on handwritten notes so nothing digital could trace her intent, and all the while her gut screamed louder, the same intuition that had made her a top investigator, now pulling her into dangerous territory, and it wasn't. Long before she noticed things at home were off too. Small things like the slight repositioning of a drawer handle, or the faint smell of cologne she didn't wear, or her laptop's browser history being just a little too short even though she hadn't cleared it. And while none of this was enough to prove intrusion, it was more than enough to confirm it. and she started using cash only, turning off her phone when not in use, keeping a burner in her glove box for outbound calls. And it was during one such call, late at night, from a quiet alley behind a laundromat in the industrial zone, that she heard the voice of someone she hadn't spoken to in years, a former journalist named Kara Voss, now independent and untraceable, who answered with just 2 words, "I heard," and then silence, until Mallory said, "What did you hear?" And Kara replied, "You let the ghost go." And before Mallory could deny anything, Kara added, "Don't worry, I'm not trying to expose it. I'm trying to survive it." And the line went dead, but not before Kara dropped a location, an encrypted GPS coordinate sent through a signal-scrambling app only used by intelligence correspondents. And Mallory knew that whatever this was, it reached far beyond her case file, because even in Kara's paranoia there was knowledge, and people with knowledge of Jack Ramsey's real work were either under surveillance or underground. And now she stood somewhere in between, unsure if she was being protected or hunted, but too deep to stop. And late that same night, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at the last physical trace of the man who had changed everything. A still frame from the security camera just before he left the precinct, where Jack Ramsey turned slightly toward the lens and gave the smallest, most deliberate glance directly into it. Not a look of fear, not even of farewell, but something else entirely, something that said, "I know you're watching, and that's exactly what I wanted." And Mallory understood in that moment that she had not been left out of the loop. She had been brought into it, carefully, deliberately, perhaps even by Jack himself, who had read her during that brief interrogation and calculated her response like an angle on a winded shot. And as she traced the curve of his shadowed jawline with her eyes, the image flickering, in black and white on her screen, she felt the weight of her choices settling on her like snowfall, soft at first but soon crushing. And then, just before dawn, she opened the manila folder she had recovered from an old backup directory, one not protected by the department, but by a shared secure drive formerly used during a multi-agency narcotics task force years ago. And there, in grainy satellite resolution, was an aerial image marked classified, showing a remote compound in what appeared to be eastern Sudan, surrounded by dense brush and crude fencing. And in the center, half obscured by a thermal bloom, was a heat signature tagged manually with a red overlay and one name, Ramsey. And as her fingers hovered over the print command, Mallory realized she had crossed the final line, not into conspiracy but into truth, the kind of truth that burns bridges, buries careers, and sometimes costs lives. And she closed the folder, her heart thundering in her ears, because she understood now. Jack. Ramsey hadn't been rescued by the general. He had been extracted to prevent what came next from being interrupted, and she was the only civilian alive who still had the trail, however faint, to follow it. And the question now wasn't whether she should, but whether she could survive what she found if she did. The jungle was breathing, thick, wet air clinging to every leaf and fiber of Jack Ramsey's uniform, as he lay prone beneath the curve of a ridgeline, half a world away from the precinct that had once tried to bury him, his rifle steady in his hands like an old friend, his eye behind the scope tuned not just to movement, but to intent, because now more than ever, he was back in his element, where things made sense, where betrayal had a scent, and the enemy didn't wear a badge or carry a warrant but moved in shadows, selling off secrets for cash or power or silence. And as the digital whisper of encrypted comms crackled in his earpiece, Ramsey exhaled slowly and scanned the compound below, a weathered facility hidden in a jungle basin surrounded by a mix of paramilitaries and mercenaries, their loyalties bought and shifting daily. And he knew the mission wasn't about extraction or elimination, not anymore. It was about the one thing his enemies feared most, exposure. And while his rifle might deliver death, it was the data, chip in his chest rig, ripped from a black site in Mogadishu, and carrying proof of an international arms funnel operated with the blessing of rogue intelligence assets that would destroy empires if it reached the right eyes. But those eyes didn't sit behind presidential desks or Pentagon walls, not this time. They belonged to a woman in a precinct office, one who had asked the wrong questions and refused to back down. And as Jack moved silently through the undergrowth, the image of Detective Aileen Mallory's face flickered briefly in his mind. Not as an investigator, but as a variable, a potential ally, someone who hadn't blinked when confronted with the weight of the invisible world. And in Washington, Mallory was feeling that weight every day, each hour heavier than the last, ever since the meeting with Kara Voss at the Silent Cafe just off Rock Creek Park, where they'd exchanged files in person, paper only, no electronics. Their conversation short but packed with consequence, and it was there that Kara had unfolded a tattered map from her coat pocket, spreading it out like a relic, revealing dots of connection across continents, Sudan, Ukraine, Colombia, Taiwan, all linked by a single name that had appeared only in fragments, redacted in memos and encrypted in payload manifests, Crossline. And as Mallory traced the red thread lines, she realized Ramsey hadn't just gone dark. He had gone underground to hunt something metastasizing inside the very agencies, meant to keep it out, and now, somehow, she was part of that hunt, even if she didn't know how or why. And it wasn't long after that meeting that the real pressure began. Her apartment broken into again. This time, her neighbor's dog poisoned. Her burner phone bricked remotely even with its battery removed, and Kara gone silent. No response on their dead drop or backup signal. And so Mallory did the only thing she could. She kept digging, slipping into federal buildings under old credentials, posing as a liaison for a fictitious interagency report. And there, inside a forgotten archive at a satellite FBI field office, she found a photo, grainy, black and white, taken from a drone 6 years ago, showing a man exiting a C-130 transport at a makeshift runway in Yemen, his posture unmistakable, the rifle slung low, the face partially obscured, but the tag below, reading Ramsey J., and stamped in the corner, Mayfly operations never to be released. And in that moment something clicked. Jack's mission hadn't ended. It had evolved, rebranded and buried beneath code words and cutouts, and whatever Mayfly was, it had never been decommissioned, only disavowed and worse. Someone was still funding it, because the same aircraft tail number had shown up on a civilian flight tracker just a week ago, departing from a contractor airfield in Nevada and flying low through South America. And if that was true, then this wasn't just about Jack anymore. This was about a system that had learned how to weaponize deniability, to privatize war while pretending to prosecute it. And as she printed the photo in the dim light of her apartment, Mallory knew she couldn't go to her captain, couldn't file a report, couldn't even call Kara anymore, because now she was being watched full-time, not just by strangers in black SUVs, but by her own department, which had quietly reassigned her partner, flagged her access badge, and issued a subtle notice that she'd be under review until further notice. And yet, despite it all, she couldn't stop, because the deeper she went, the clearer it became that Jack Ramsey had walked back into the fire not to protect himself, but to contain something that had no leash, no oversight, and no national boundary. And then one night a package arrived, no return address, just a padded envelope inside her mailbox, containing a single USB drive and a note written in block. Letters, for her eyes only, trust is a weapon. And when she ran the drive on an isolated air-gapped laptop, the screen went black for a moment, then displayed a live feed encryption crackling to life, audio only but unmistakable. It was Jack's voice, calm, deliberate, weathered by fire but intact, saying, "If you're hearing this, it means you're still in," followed by coordinates, code phrases and a warning. They're inside the system, all of it. The mission wasn't to stop them, it was to keep them busy until now. And with that, the screen went dark again, wiping itself completely, and Mallory sat there for a long time in silence, her hands trembling, not from fear but from realization, because this wasn't over. It had only just begun. The dawn was cold and still when Detective Aileen Mallory stepped out onto the cracked pavement of the abandoned airfield where her last meeting with Jack Ramsey was to take place, the wind stirring dead leaves like ghosts of past battles. And as she looked out across the empty runway, long since stripped of planes and life, she felt the weight of everything that had come before, the arrests, the betrayals, the secrets buried beneath layers of deception thicker than any sniper's. Camo. And yet, despite the darkness that had wrapped around her since the moment Jack had vanished, she also felt something else, a strange kind of clarity, as if the entire path had been leading her here to this point, where the truth would no longer be a whispered rumor or a shadow on a file, but a living, breathing force that could change everything. And as the first light of the sun cracked through the distant tree line, she saw him, Jack Ramsay, leaning against the cold metal of a rusted hangar, his eyes sharp, his posture calm but alert, a faint smile breaking the hard edges of his face as if he knew the weight of her questions before she even spoke them. And when she finally did, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, she asked, "Why? Why all of this? Why risk everything to disappear only to come back into the fire?" And Jack's gaze flickered with something older than regret or anger, something like resolve, as he replied, "Because sometimes the war doesn't end when the mission does. Sometimes it just changes uniforms, changes faces, and the sniper's job isn't just to take the shot, but to protect the shot that changes the world." And in that moment, Mallory understood that Jack's role had been far more than a soldier. It had been the keeper of a fragile balance between chaos and order, a line walked alone, with only the cold comfort of distance and precision. And as he unfolded a battered dossier filled with photos, encrypted drives, and witness testimonies, he laid bare the real enemy, not a single man or agency, but a sprawling network of power brokers, arms dealers, and corrupt officials who thrived on conflict and secrecy. And with each page, Mallory saw not just the scale of the battle, but the stakes, innocent lives caught in the crossfire, nations manipulated through proxy wars, and justice obscured by layers of lies. And yet, despite the enormity of it all, Jack's plan was simple in its brutal elegance: expose the rot before it consumed everything. And with Mallory's help, he intended to do exactly that, even if it meant walking into the lion's den one last time, facing enemies armed with better weapons, deeper pockets, and no rules. And as they prepared to leave the empty airfield together, the sun fully risen now, casting long shadows behind them, Mallory felt a fierce hope ignite within her. Hope not just for the mission's success, but for a future where the truth could no longer be silenced by power or fear. And though the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, she knew one thing with unwavering certainty: the legacy of the Navy sniper who had been handcuffed unjustly, only to be rescued by a 4-star general, was not just a story of injustice corrected, but the beginning of a reckoning that would change the very fabric of the world. And as they disappeared down the cracked runway side by side, the sniper's legacy was no longer just his, it was theirs.